Good morning, everybody. My name is Richard Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives special Archives Month presentation of Ask Us Anything About Records Appraisal. Today's presenter is Sarah Durling, and Sarah will be joined, or is joined, by Jennifer O'Neill. Sarah is the New York State Archives Records Advisory Officer for School District, BOCES, Community Colleges, and Teacher Centers, but she is one of our astute specialists on records to provide records advice, and she's extremely knowledgeable. And Jennifer is the head of New York State Archives Scheduling and State Agency Services, so there's an extremely knowledgeable person here when it comes to records management in general, but state agency records management in particular. So this session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box to the right of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And at this point in time, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Rich. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation, or really more of a question and answer session over anything. Like Rich said, I'm Sarah. My colleague Jennifer is here. We are going to ask and answer all the questions that you have about records appraisal. So, if you have questions, I know Rich just said to hold them at the end, we usually do. If you have any questions about records appraisal, we want to hear them from you. You know, if you're not sure how things are done, if we say something that doesn't make sense to you, please type them in the chat because we want to answer them as you are having these questions. And then, we'll answer some questions that we've already received or our commonly asked questions that we do get on the appraisal topic so that, we have something to engage with. So, Jennifer, are you ready? Are we excited?
I'm ready, Sarah.
All right, this is going to be awesome. I know it. So, why don't we throw the first question to Jennifer? What is appraisal?
All right, well, this kind of sets the scene for the whole webinar today. So, appraisal is really the process of evaluating records based on their value to an organization. We like to define appraisal broadly, so we like to say that we're evaluating records on a variety of different types of value, including administrative value to your organization, legal value, how long do things need to be kept because of legal reasons or statute of limitations, and fiscal value. What are the audit requirements that require that you keep records for a certain period of time? So we like to think of appraisal as including that retention scheduling component. However, a lot of people, when they hear the word appraisal, they think particularly of the process for determining if the records have permanent historical value. And that's primarily what we're going to focus on today. So the goal of appraisal is to make sure that those records that have the highest value in terms of historical value are preserved, and those are the ones that are going to document major activities and functions of an organization, and particularly with government, the government's impact on communities across New York State. Appraisal is a really fundamental part of your records management program, and I think here at the archives, at least within my unit, we see appraisal as one of the most important parts of our job that we do. So I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Jen. So the next, I can get this one. The next question is, how do I know if a record has historical value? So first thing you want to do, folks, is you want to take a look at the appropriate retention schedule for those records. The State Archives has been given responsibility for identifying state agency and local government records with enduring historical value. And as part of doing that, we, subject those records to an internal appraisal process. If we determine a record has historical value, we designate the record as permanent in the LGS-1 or the State General Schedule, and LGS-1. And then in the State General Schedule, we're going to have transfer to archives or in your individual RDAs. Local governments, don't worry about RDAs. State agencies have their own set of record schedules specific to their individual responsibilities, and those are called RDAs. So if you see either of those things, if you're in a local government, you see permanent in the schedule, that's a record that's got historical value, you need to hold on to it. If you're a state agency and it says transfer to archives on those schedules anywhere, that's a historical record. In addition, local governments might see an appraisal note in the LGS-1 that flags records that may have historical value. These record series may have historical or research significance for some local governments, but not necessarily all of them. You know, it might be in some and not necessarily in others. We can't identify all of them. So what we ask is that local governments take the time before they, throw the records in the shredder to assess them on a case-by-case basis to make sure that, yes, these are records that have historical value and we do need to maintain them, or no, they're not and we can dispose of them. If no schedule item exists for these records, you need to let us know because it may be of interest to archival collections, particularly if it's a state agency. We want to take a look at those records and determine whether those are something that should come to the state archives ultimately. Or if you're a local government, we need to know that it's not in the schedule somewhere so that we can evaluate it and make sure that that goes into the schedule in a future iteration. All right. Oh, Jennifer's going to be the better source for this one. What sort of questions do you ask for an appraisal?
All right, I think we have, do we have the questions or the answers already on the screen?
There they are.
Excellent. You're going to want to ask a series of questions to determine whether the records contain enough information to adequately document the people, the places, or events recorded, or to adequately document the decisions made in relation to them. So here are the types of questions that you should ask when you take a look at when you're taking a look at a set of records. So you'll want to first ask, when were these records created? If the records were created during, say, a time of momentous change, so like perhaps during the COVID-19 pandemic that we've been experiencing, then those might have long-term historical value. If the records are scarce, so let's say often scarce records are ones that are really old records, then maybe they may have historical value. Or if they cover a long period of time. So these are records that document maybe the history of your government. If they're only covering a short period of time, then that's not really giving you a very good snapshot of what the history of a particular function was over the course of time. You'll also want to look at what kind of information do the records contain. So those records that contain more in-depth information are probably more likely to have historical value. So if you have, for instance, a legal case file, that's going to contain a lot of information about what the attorney was thinking, what advice they were giving, what was the information that was provided to the court, what was some of the research that was done. So it contains a lot of in-depth information. That being said, sometimes summary information, summary records are equally as good, especially when you might otherwise have large volumes of records. So for instance, for both state agencies and local governments, we have items in your general schedules that say that annual reports of governments should be kept permanently or transferred to the state archives. Also, if you have a complete set of information for records, those are obviously going to be more valuable than something that is not complete. You'll also want to look at who the creator of the records are. So records that reflect an employee's perspective or an individual point of view may be more significant, particularly those records that are created by someone who's in a decision-making position, like an executive. So that might be the commissioner of your agency, the supervisor of your town, the superintendent of your schools, the chief of police. And also, we sometimes like to see what the experience might have been from an actual employee's perspective, to see how they saw the government functions from their perspective. That might be an interesting perspective to preserve. We also want to know what other records exist. So if the information in the records exists in other records within the government, or even in another entity, it could be at the, if you're a local government, at the state level or at the federal level. If there's another source of information for these records, then the records are less likely to be significant. So if you are a local government and you're uploading your arrest reports to the state's e-justice portal, then obviously the records at the local level are going to be less significant than those at the state level. And the same thing for school records. So school information that is shared with the New York State Education Department, the local school district records are going to have less value than those compiled at the state level. You'll want to also look at the uniqueness of these records. Are they documenting the unique history of the record or the community served? So this gets at, are there certain important time periods, like the pandemic, like a disaster, maybe an anniversary that the government is celebrating? Or are there other events, maybe special events that are hosted by the government that can provide clues to how the events affected the development of the government and the community it serves? And one bullet point that should have been included on this slide is, do your records relate to underdocumented aspects of New York's history, such as racial or ethnic population groups, or the poor, the mentally ill, incarcerated? So keep your eyes open for records that meet those criteria as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Ooh, this is a good question. How does the State Archives determine if records have historical value?
All right, so in my role as appraisal coordinator at the State Archives, I think I can say that the New York State Archives has one of the most rigorous appraisal processes in the country. We usually hear about potential archival records from governments when you ask us retention scheduling questions. For state agencies, this would be usually when you submit a scheduling request to us. So please continue to keep directing those questions and requests to us. This really helps us to identify records that might have historic value. We may also learn about records that might have potential historical value if there's some legislation that causes new records to be created, or we hear about a new government entity being established. So usually when we hear about that, our ears are perked up that there might be some potential historical records that may be being created in those instances. So we talk with records creators, and those records creators are the subject matter experts about the records and the functions that those records develop. So we ask those questions that we just talked about in the previous slide, and we ask those of the records creators, and we also think about those questions and answer those questions throughout the rest of the process. We also like to physically review the records. This helps us better understand how they're organized, what condition they're in, what their size is, what the volume is, and what the contents of the records are. When we return to the office, we do research so that we can understand the history and functions of the government or the unit within the government that's creating the records. And this helps us to place those records into context. We then compile all the information that we've gathered from records creators, from our research, from physically reviewing the records, and put that into an appraisal report. The State Archives staff person who prepares the report recommends whether or not the records have historical value, and they present that report to a team we have here in the State Archives called the Appraisal team. And also the State Archivist reviews those recommendations and makes a final determination. So that final decision about whether the records are historical or not is integrated into our retention schedules. So as Sarah mentioned before, if you're a local government, you'll see that records with historical value will say permanent, or they will have an appraisal note in the LGS1. For state agencies, your retention schedules will say transfer to State Archives. Back to you, Sarah.
I can absolutely vouch for the rigorous nature of the appraisal process. I've been through a few of them myself, and a couple of weeks ago I got to go on an adventure with Jennifer to evaluate a set of records that the Archives is considering bringing in. So it's an interesting process, and I really think a lot of you would enjoy it, honestly. So the next question, and I'm going to take a couple of these because I've been making Jennifer do all the talking. Do records have to be old to have potential historical value? And I think Jennifer's already touched on this a little bit, but the answer is a big, loud, resounding, all caps no. Records do not have to be old to be archival. Government officials create and use archival records daily in office. What makes a record worthy of permanent retention and special management is the continuing importance of the information it contains. So Jennifer mentioned the COVID-19 records. I want you to think about those for a minute. What records that you've been creating in your organization that would document your government's COVID-19 pandemic response so that would be potentially worthy of historical preservation? I'm going to pick on school districts here because, guys, I know you're the best right now. You just did an amazing thing. You were educating kids all online. What about all of the things that you've done in the last couple of years that are, particularly noteworthy, have historical value, or that are ones that you're going to want to save because somebody's going to want those for research in the future. It's a thing to think about. The next question is, who should be involved in appraising records for historical value? I know that there's some of you thinking out there. Maybe the RMO? That's fair. So one of the things I want everybody to take home with them is that records management is not a one-person job. And this is across the board, doesn't matter what part of records management we're looking at, right? It's not just appraisal. Records management is an everybody responsibility, whether you're the records management officer who's actually managing the program, the liaisons in various departments who are trying to keep track of all of the records within their departments, or the people who are using and creating those records. Everybody has to manage those records on some level. And when it comes to appraising those records for historical value, you're involving all of these people again. You want that records management officer who is going to be making the decisions on, whether or not these, or at least spearheading the committee that is making the decisions on whether or not these records are going to be historical, they're going to have that long-term preservation. You're going to want to, as part of this appraisal process, talk to the folks who are creating and using the records because they are going to know those records the best. They're going to be able to tell you what those records were used for, why they were created, and why they may be important. You might be really great at figuring things out and understanding what records are for, but you're never going to know those records as well as the people who actually use those on a regular basis, who actually are working with them. So you definitely want to make sure that you're reaching out to those folks, getting their opinion, and finding out what their thoughts are on them as well, and getting all the background information on them. Why were these records created? How were they created? In response to what? So that you have a full picture of what you're going to be doing as you're doing your appraisal. We also want to strongly encourage you to reach out to your New York State Archives government advisory staff. If you're in a local government, there's a page on our website that has all of your local government records advisory officers who are more than happy to help you figure out whether or not you're looking at historical records, whether we're providing you advice on how to do the appraisal or giving you our opinion of the records. If you are a state agency, you need to talk to the folks in state agency services because they are going to be the folks that are going to guide you through this process. Jennifer is the head of that unit, and I'm sure she's really excited to talk to all of you about this. This isn't a one-person process is the thing that I want you all to go home with, is that this is something that multiple people should be involved in on some level. And of course, we're not just going to set you out in the wild to do this on your own with no background. One of the questions we get from folks who are, they look at the schedule, it says, appraise these records. And they're like, what? We have resources available to you on our website. So let's go take a look at some of these. First of all, let's hop a slide. And second, share. Web browser. Dun, 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 dun. Come on, I had the right one up. All right. So we have the New York State Archives website. It's wonderful. It's glorious. It's very exciting. There are a couple places on this website that I want you to go. I want you to go to records management. I want you to go to topics. Under topics, I want you to go to retention and disposition. Under retention and disposition, I want you to go to historical records. And under historical records, all of this is good information, by the way. I highly recommend rereading it as you're going through. You're going to the appraisal page, and this will talk to you about the appraisal process for your records and the appraisal process at the State Archives. It gives you a lot of information that's going to be very valuable to you. Additionally, if you go out to our workshops page, our lovely workshops page, you go down to webinars. One, this recording will be on this page eventually. But two, all right, so we scroll down a little bit here. Dun, da, da, da. We have a fair number of all right. All right, the web page has decided to kick out on me. Yay. Recover web page. Yes? No? Maybe? All right. Well, I assure you, if you go to workshop topic, this drop down here, if you pick retention schedules and hit apply, it will bring up all the retention schedule related workshops that we have. And there are a trio of mini modules, short recordings, about a half an hour, on records appraisal. There's 2 for local governments because you guys are going to be doing a lot of this on your own. And then there's 1 for state agencies that talks to you about how you're supposed to do, how to go through the process with us. They're great information, and they are going to provide you with a lot of help and assistance as you're going through the process. Additionally, like I said, call us at the state archives. You know, the state agency folks, the local government folks, we want to help you. That's our job. That's our responsibility to help you with managing the local government, managing your appraisal process, and any records management issues you have, honestly. You also want to go to the state agency and local government retention schedules because those are going to be documents that clearly say, you know, these are records that are either permanent, need to be appraised, or need to be transferred to the state archives depending on what government type you are. So they do a lot of the work for you. They already do identify things that you need to keep an eye out for, you know, as to whether or not they're going to be historical records. We looked at the webinars, we looked at the workshops. We also have a publication called Appraisal of Local Government Records for Historical Value for Local Governments. If you give us a holler, we're more than happy to send you a copy. All right, I'm getting parched. Jennifer, what are examples of records that have historical value?
All right. Well, hopefully you're not getting too overwhelmed at this point. We thought we would share with you some general categories of records and some examples of ones that would have historical value for both local governments and state agencies. So I think we have these listed on the next slide, right, Sarah? Great. So one of the probably most obvious categories of records are going to be those of executives or people who are in decision-making positions. So this would be the state agency commissioner or your school superintendent, your village mayor, and also don't forget about your governing bodies and the minutes that they're creating as evidence of the deliberations and decisions that they're making. Another category of archival records are those of your attorney or counsel's office, and those are going to document the development of laws that pertain to your government. Your attorneys are also involved in significant litigation cases, particularly those that might have precedential value. They also will be giving out legal opinions, and those generally have archival value. They may also be making other types of decisions that are precedential. For state agencies that have adjudicatory bodies, those decisions that are made are legal in nature and may have historical value. Another general category of records are those records that relate to public relations. So those are records being created to describe the events and activities and get out important information about what your government does. So that's going to include things like news releases, your annual reports, and other types of publications, whether they're paper, audio, visual, any type of publication that you may be producing. Another category of records are those that document real property acquisition and disposition. So this would be records of if you are selling a school building that you currently own, or you're closing down a mental health facility and that campus is going to be going up for sale, or if you're buying land so that you can put up a new building. Those records have long-term value. If you are involved in capital construction projects or major public works projects, these projects usually involve a lot of resources, financial resources, and they may have a significant environmental impact in your community. And then finally, records that document significant events, including disasters. These could be natural disasters like flooding or things like fires. 9/11 was an example of a disaster. We actually reached out to state agencies and received a number of records relating to how agencies responded to 9/11. Pandemics, including this current pandemic, also other pandemics like West Nile disease, the Spanish flu epidemic in the early 1900s, and records that might document closures of facilities because that might be some sort of a milestone within your government. Next slide.
All right, so next question is, I have a record series that exists in both paper and electronic format or microfilm. Which format should be preserved?
So this is what everyone hates to hear. The answer is it depends. So there's really a series of questions that you need to ask to determine which format should be preserved. So you'll want to ask, which format is the official copy? So if you have digitized some paper records, have you designated the digitized copy as your official record, or is the paper record still your official copy? It's important that you follow certain standards when creating particularly digital records, but also microfilm records. So did you follow those standards that we've very conscientiously researched and put together to help ensure that you're creating records in the best possible way so that they will withstand the test of time? So make sure that whatever format you decide on has followed appropriate standards for creation. Look at which format is the most complete or is in the best condition. So we're currently dealing with a situation where we've inherited some microfilm. The microfilm, unfortunately, was not preserved in good environmental conditions, and it's on acetate microfilm, so it is readily deteriorating. So we are trying to identify other sources and other formats that we can preserve, because we're not going to be able to preserve this microfilm that is very readily deteriorating. Does your government have resources to continue to maintain access to electronic records? We get a lot of questions about or from governments who ask, can I destroy original paper records after scanning? And they'll ask particularly with records that have a permanent or an archival designation on the retention schedule. And we have to caution them that it's a greater responsibility, a greater challenge to preserve electronic records than it is paper or microfilm. So you really need to be aware of the substantial resources that are involved in preserving electronic records. That includes the need to continually migrate records to new formats, to new software, to new hardware. So you're going to need to have some sort of a migration plan in place. You may want to decide or consider keeping a couple of different formats. So you keep an electronic format for ease and access, and you keep a microfilm or paper copy because those are solid preservation formats. I think we're ready for the next question.
All right. So do photographs have historical value?
So here's another it depends answer. So keep in mind that photographs is a type of format, just like emails. So they're not a record series per se. So you're going to need to look at the content of that photograph. What is that photograph documenting? Is it documenting an important event? Is it documenting, you know, the daily life of maybe, say, a student? So for that purpose, it would have some historical value. Another question you should ask is, what is the condition of the photograph? Very often we see, and we cringe when we see this, we see photographs stored in magnetic photo albums. So those are the albums that have the sticky pages that were used extensively. The sticky residue on the back does a great job at holding the photographs to the page, but it's not the best preservation medium, and it's very difficult to remove photographs from those pages without damaging them. So you want to look at condition issues like that. Another important question is, are they labeled? And we also see too often photographs that have no contextual information provided. So you see a lot of images of people in the photographs, but there's no names attached to them. So without having information that puts the record or puts the photographs in context, that really diminishes the value quite a bit.
Thank you. All right, so where do records go when you've finished your appraisal of them?
Oh, that's my question. So for local governments, you'll want to store your historical records in whatever you've designated as your archival repository. So if you're dealing with a small volume of records, you might want to consider putting them into a vault or a fireproof file cabinet, something like that. Or if you have a larger set of records, or even if you don't have a large set of records, you may have designated part of your storage area for storing archival records. For state agencies, you'll want to follow the disposition note that says that historical records need to be transferred to the state archives, and the state archives is mandated with preserving records that document New York State government. For local governments and state agencies, you'll want to make sure that the storage conditions within which these records are stored are good, that there's good environmental controls available. You'll want to also make sure that the records are going to be available and accessible to researchers. So making sure that you're creating good container lists and indexes and labeling your folder tabs well, all of those types of descriptive aids are going to make sure that researchers can readily access these records. You may also want to consider, particularly if you're a local government, making your digital copies available online so your researchers can access records from the comfort of their couch at home.
I know I like doing my research from my couch at home. It's much more comfortable than my office chair. So I think the next question is also more up your alley, Jennifer. Are appraisal decisions permanent, or can we go back and reevaluate them if we need to?
So this is another, it depends and not necessarily. So you know that over time, society's values change. You know, it's important to constantly reassess and reevaluate decisions that are made. So some questions that you'll want to ask and consider. So the records that may be good candidates for reappraisal are going to be those records that have gotten little or no research use. They're going to be ones that no longer agree with the acquisitions policy of the New York State Archives, and will make you aware when that happens, or the acquisition policy of your local government. It may also be for records that where you find that better sources of records exist that contain equivalent information, and you found those records, and we may decide that those other records might be more accessible than and maybe in better condition than the records that you have. Those records that have been reformatted and a new format takes up less space or has more functionality. So as you and as the State Archives continues to digitize records, it may be that the digital copy is really all that is necessary, and you may want to consider getting rid of the paper copy, or we may decide to get rid of the paper copy in our holdings. Another reason or question is if there's a reasonable basis for believing that a previous decision appraisal was not valid. So, you know, as I said before, we do have a rigorous appraisal process, but sometimes things change, or maybe we discover information that we previously didn't have when we made the appraisal decision. So, you know, I think keeping an open mind, we can always reconsider appraisal decisions going forward.
Thanks. I think we also want to stress that that's not something that happens commonly, but it is something that there's an opportunity for.
Good point.
Oh, I'm going to take this one, I'm going to take this one. So if I know a record series is historical, what should I consider when creating it? So here's the thing. This depends on the format somewhat, right? Because if you're creating paper records, you're going to have different considerations that you know, if you're creating electronic records. So if we're talking about paper, you know, and you know it's going to be a permanent historical series, print it out on an acid-free paper, high-quality paper, because that's going to give it the best shot at a long life. And when you store them in acid-free folders and boxes, because again, that's also going to give it the best shot for life. And when you're boxing these, please do not use hanging folders, because those are going to damage the boxes, and they're going to take up more space, and they're going to make everybody sad. If you're talking about electronic records, you know, if you're creating electronic records, you want to use a non-proprietary format that's likely to remain accessible for several years whenever humanly possible. I know it's not always possible given that we're in government environments, but if you have the opportunity, please do so. You also want to make sure that you're developing a migration plan, so you need to talk to your IT folks about this. Jennifer was talking about this a little bit. Electronic records do take more care and responsibility in a lot of ways than paper records. So you want to make sure you have that migration plan so you can make sure that records remain accessible for the duration of their permanent life. It's not enough to simply have a copy of the file if you can't open it. You need to be able to get at the content of that record. If you are in a situation where you're not sure that, you know, moving to an electronic environment is going to be the best decision to be able to continually access those records, you may want to consider retaining a paper or microfilm copy. Microfilm is still completely valid. It's eye-readable, and it takes up very little space. So it is totally a valid option. If you're digitizing these records, and we did have a question about that, you know, you're taking your paper records and turning them electronic, you want to make sure that you are following the New York State Digital Imaging Guidelines. I threw a link in the chat. These are going to be very specific guidelines that you need to follow to be able to legally convert your records to an electronic format, your paper records to an electronic format, and dispose of the original paper copies. So make sure you take a look at that. If you are thinking about digitizing your records, we want them to be in a proprietary lossless format. We identify PDFA and lossless TIFF in the publication. So, you know, take a look at it. It is a big document. Make sure, you know, bring in your IT folk, give them donuts and bagels, make it a party. For all of your electronic files, you want, and even your paper files, you want to use meaningful labeling when you are putting labels on these files, when you're naming them. Whether it's the file name, the file folder, you want to make sure that you can just skim your eyes across the file names in the computer, the files in the drawers, and understand what's supposed to be in those files without having to go into each and every one, you know, opening it up, taking a look and going, oh, that's what that is. Use meaningful file names and be consistent about it. You also want to keep your temperature and humidity steady in storage areas so that you are, you know, again, maintaining an environment for those records to thrive in. Okay, so I'm going to take this one too. I have government records that I want to give to the local historical society. Can I do that? And what sort of paperwork is involved? So let's start with state agencies. State agency records are designated as archivable, It means it's going to say transfer to archives on your retention schedule, and these should be transferred to the state archives. They are not leaving the state government service. If you're a state agency and your records aren't scheduled and you're not quite sure what to do with the records, please contact us. We're going to have an email address in an upcoming slide. Send us an email. Jennifer will get, and her people will get right with you, and we will figure this out. If you're a local government, you get a couple options here. Local government records can be donated only, and I do mean this, only if the records can be disposed of. In other words, they're not permanent, they've met their retention period, and otherwise they are going to the shredder. If you want to give these records to a historical association, a historical society, you can do this with a deed of gift. This provides documentation to show that legal custody of the records has been turned over from the government to the historical association. The historical association now owns those records. Again, these are records that are non-permanent and have passed the retention period. If they're still within the retention period, you may still have to hold on to them. You do still have to maintain legal ownership of those. But if the records are records that are permanent public records and your local government is just storing them and they're not being stored in the best conditions, and you know there's an interest out there that people actually want to access these records and you don't have the resources to do that, but the historical association, you know, they've got a fantastic records room, they've got a great research center, and they're going to be able to provide access of these records to the public who really have the interest in them. You might be able to do a deposit agreement, which transfers the physical custody of the records to the historical association, the historical society, in that they're going to maintain and care for the physical those records from a physical perspective, but keeps the legal ownership with the government. So basically you're loaning them to the historical association to manage for you. But should they decide they no longer want to do so, they have to come back to the government. We do see this happen every once in a while, but again, it's not very common. So, Jennifer, I think this is a question for you. Is historical value the only reason you'd appraise records as having permanent value?
So not necessarily. When we appraise records, we're looking at not just historical value, but we're also looking at what is the administrative value or informational value of the records, so that we can determine how long the records need to be kept. We also look at legal value. So sometimes the law specifically says that a record needs to be kept permanently, and it's not necessarily because it has historical value. I think a good example of this is, so school districts, they need to keep physician documentation of traumatic brain injuries. The education law specifically says those records need to be kept permanently. So we need to keep those records permanently. Another example that we're actually looking at the records right now is the state education department's counsel's office. They maintain some legal appeals records, and those records, it does say in law that those records must be kept permanently. So some of those records might have historical value, but because the law does say, it has wording that implies that the records must be kept permanently, we have to keep all of them permanently. So those, those are a couple of areas where, historical value isn't the only reason for appraising records.
Awesome, thank you. So with that, that is the last of the questions we had gotten ahead of time, or had known that we're likely to get. So if you'd like to throw questions in the chat, because we've got 6 minutes left, please throw them at us. We'd love to hear from you. We do have a question. Would annual forums be a candidate for archival preservation? Well, it would depend on what those annual forums were for and what purpose they would serve, I would think. Jennifer?
Yeah. Is the question, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Would annual forums be a candidate for archival preservation?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what you said, Sarah. I think we need to know a little bit more information about what those forums are and how they relate to the government.
Yeah, so it really is getting into the content and why they're being held, what their purpose is. Rich, do you have anything lurking in the background that didn't get sent to everybody?
Well, I'm just scrolling down. There is, yes, there is a question here from Camille. She asks, sorry I'm late. Can you cover the reporting requirements for local governments when they receive a grant? Or perhaps this would be a different forum.
Yeah, I definitely think that's probably going to cover a different topic. If you wanted to send an email to recmanagement@nicet.gov, it's the email up on the screen, so that we can get into the specifics of what you're looking for. Whether it's a grant that you receive from the federal government or one of our local government grants, we'd be more than happy to help you out with that front.
I don't see any other questions directed just to me. Oh yes, no, I'm sorry. It's just Camille says thank you. Great. But no, I don't see any other questions directed toward me at this point in time, Sarah.
All right. Well, while we wait and see if anybody else has got any burning questions in the background, if you have any questions about anything at any time, about anything records management related, whether it is records appraisal or I can't find something in the retention schedule, please help me. Please feel free to send an email to recmanagement@nicet.gov. Again, it's the email on the screen. And your email will be directed to the most appropriate person for that, whether that's me, Jennifer, or any of our colleagues. We're more than happy to help you. And if you have any records that you have, you think are of historical value, if you're a state agency, please reach out to us. I know Jennifer wants to hear from you. And if you're a local government, you're not quite sure what you want to do, reach out to us because we're here to help. We will come out and take a look at those records and help you figure it out. Jennifer, do you have anything you want to let the people know before we close out?
Well, just to reemphasize what you said, I mean, we really rely on you as the subject matter experts to let us know when you think that a particular record series might have long-term historical value. You're the ones that we hear from and where we learn of these potentially historical records. So please reach out to us and let us know. Also note that there's not a space between rec management and @nicet.gov. It's all together.
Yeah, it's a formatting. Oopsie. All right.
I did also want to just add really quickly that if anybody here is watching in a larger group of people, that's more than one, if you could just type that number into the chat box, that way we'll get a better sense of how many people we're viewing. So if there's 2, 3, 27 of you, if you could type that in, that would be great. But if it's just one person, no need to do that. Oh, there is one question here sent to me from Henry. Do old real property tax records beyond the retention period have historical value?
So real property tax rolls, there are certain rolls depending on where you are in local government, are going to have a a permanent retention period noted and thus have historical value. So it really depends on you know, where you are in the function of real property taxes. So I would encourage you to look in the LGS1 under the what is it? Real is it taxation and assessment?
Yeah, it's
section?
tax and assessment.
Yeah.
And you can get to the LGS1 from our website if you go under the retention section. All right. If nobody else has any questions, thank you so much for attending. It is 11 o'clock. Go enjoy the rest of your day. Have an early lunch, and we will talk to you guys next time.